Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new episode of Come Together, a joint initiative of the European People's Party and the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies. Today, we will discuss the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the global repercussions of this war. For that, I'm joined by David McAllister, Vice President of the EPP and member of the European Parliament, where he chairs the Committee of Foreign Affairs, and Jolyon Howorth, Professor Emeritus and Jean Monnet Professor ad personam of European Politics at University of Bath and Senior Research Associate of the Martin Center. Welcome, speakers. A week ago, against all predictions, Vladimir Putin did start a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Thousands of refugees are moving towards bordering countries, but also thousands of volunteers are joining the Ukrainian army in defending their territory, uniting behind their president, Volodymyr Zelensky. Vice President McAllister, my first question is about Putin's calculation and strategy. In your opinion, are Putin's regime and military weak? Will he escalate more and more? And are there any red lines left for him not to cross? Vice President.
Well, the Kremlin and President Putin are unpredictable, but one thing is clear, President Putin has crossed so many red lines since the 24th of February. What we are witnessing is the most serious and brutal violation of international law in Europe since the end of the Second World War in 1945. And this is not only a Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is not only a war of Russia supported by Belarus, actively supported by Belarus against Ukraine. This is an attack on democracy. This is an attack on our liberty. This is an attack on our security. This is an attack on the way we want to live together in Europe. We in Europe have given us some rules, and these rules say that we respect each other's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, that we don't threaten each other, and we certainly do not harm each other. And what we have seen is just so horrible and awful. The whole concept behind this, to obviously divide Europe or even the world into spheres of interest, is a concept of the 21st century and simply doesn't fit in the 20th century. In the 21st century, it's a concept of the 19th century. So Russia has committed a number of war crimes against humanity. It's continuing to do so. It's attacking hospitals, schools, kindergartens. Innocent children are dying. And this is all outrageous, and we will need to draw our conclusions from this. And in the meantime, it's our duty to stand in solidarity with Ukraine, because once again, the brave Ukrainians who are defending their country are not only defending their country, they're also defending the concept of a free Europe.
Thank you, Vice President. And Professor Howorth, as a follow-up to that, in your opinion, has NATO enlargement enhanced or weakened overall security and stability in the Eurasian space?
Well, Putin's brazen aggression against Ukraine has actually skewed the narrative of the crisis. The universal consensus is that Putin is the aggressor, and this has made it difficult for analysts to offer a full background perspective. Putin's deranged rants about Ukrainian history and his assertion that Ukraine is not a real nation have almost squeezed out the identification of other factors behind the current crisis. Today, anybody who raises the issue of NATO enlargement risks being accused of supporting Putin, and that is grotesque. It's a major disservice to the cause of truth. The answer to the question of NATO's enhancing or weakening overall stability and security in the Eurasian space is very complex. One short answer might be that we now have a major war at the heart of that Eurasian space. Enlargement has clearly not produced what its advocates said was their objective, a Europe whole, free, and at peace. So let's put ourselves in the context of early 1990, several weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There were many different scenarios for a new Eurasian security order. Some spoke of merging NATO and the Warsaw Pact in a single security space from Vancouver to Vladivostok. Mikhail Gorbachev spoke dreamily of a common European home. French President François Mitterrand launched the idea of a European confederation from the Atlantic to the Urals. And many believed that the OSCE was the new hope for the future. There were two factors that ensured that none of that happened and that NATO enlargement became the reality. The first was the determination of the United States to extend its sphere of influence as far eastwards as possible in Europe without provoking a Russian backlash. The other was the equally strong desire for NATO membership on the part of all Central and East European states. And that story is told in a brilliant new book by the US historian Mary Sorotti, Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of the Post-Cold War Stalemate. Final point, both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton were well aware of the risks of NATO expansion, and they tried every means possible to make it palatable to the Russians. The Russians were never reassured and continued to argue over this entire 30-year period that it was a bad idea. You simply cannot ignore that perception. In no way does that excuse or justify anything that Putin has done, but it can't be airbrushed out of the equation.
Thank you, Professor, for also that historic perspective. And Vice President, let us talk about the European reaction. So many might argue or argued that instead of acting, the EU reacted. Is this true in your opinion? And what does the EU's decision to provide arms and other equipments to Ukraine via their European Peace Facility mean for the EU's strategic culture?
What we've seen in the last few days and weeks is remarkable unity among the 27 member states of the European Union, but also in close coordination with our transatlantic partners and other like-minded partners, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, just to name a few. So there's a close coordination. And what we have put into place is the largest and most severe sanctions package in the history of the European Union. 3 packages have now been adopted, and I'm very sure that these sanctions will suppress Russia's economic growth, increase the borrowing costs, raise inflation, intensify capital outflows, and gradually erode its industrial base. What President Putin, or perhaps we should precisely name him Dictator Putin, what he has done is so outrageous that the Putin regime will be isolated financially, economically, and politically. So that is the first point I want to make. The second point is, for the European Union, I expect fundamental changes in the way we organize our defense and security policy. One of the lessons we have learned from these horrible events in Ukraine is that we in Europe have to think strategically about ourselves, our environment, and our world. You will see in the next days and weeks how all European, NATO, and EU member states will announce an increase in defense spending. And I am in favor of a closer coordination on European security and defense. But our activities should never be against NATO or in competition with NATO or duplicating NATO capabilities. It's about strengthening the European pillar within the framework of NATO. I have large expectations in the new strategic compass of the EU, which presumably will be adopted in the end of March. This strategic compass for me is a kind of a white book for the European security and defense policy, and this has been a demand of the European People's Party for many, many years. And a third point I want to mention is energy. What we have realized now is that some of our member states of the European Union are far too dependent on energy imports from third countries, in particular Russia. So what we will have to do, and this will have to be done very quickly, is to diversify our energy sources and in the way energy is being supplied. We must quickly reduce imports from Russia as regards gas, coal, and oil, because the regime of President Putin is using energy deliveries as a political weapon.
Thank you very much, Vice President. And Professor Howorth, in a way, a similar question to you. Moscow has never perceived the EU as a credible military or defense actor. So is this changed now? Will it change in the near future, in your opinion?
Until about a week ago, I argued that the EU had failed to deliver on the promise of its Common Security and Defence Policy, CSDP. Over the past 40 years, I've published 5 books and hundreds of articles on CSDP, and I've long hoped that the EU would emerge as a consequential security actor. I believe European strategic autonomy is in the best interests of both Europe and the United States, and I believe that it will have to happen through NATO. But divisions within the 27, as well as the continued existence of NATO alongside CSDP, have prevented the EU from delivering on its promise. CSDP has mounted some 40 overseas crisis management missions, but they've been largely small scale and civilian. And that's not the route to strategic autonomy. So in the run-up to Putin's invasion, we saw that the EU 27 were deeply divided over several key issues: sending lethal weapons to Ukraine, offering Ukraine membership of NATO or the EU, differences over appropriate sanctions. They were even divided over dialogue with Moscow. And as a result, the EU was sidelined in the negotiations, which were conducted really in strict bilateral format between the US and Russia. Now, what Putin appears to have done in just about a week is to turn the EU into a credible actor at every level, including the military. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. True, Germany is now massively stepping up its defense budget, as are other countries. True, the EU has for the first time ever agreed to export lethal weapons to a third country. True, the EU appears to have papered over its long-standing divisions over how to deal with Russia. But one swallow does not make a summer, and there's still, in my view, a very long way to go before we can say that a radical change has happened. All the things that David McAllister mentioned are true and are happening, but I think that the change will happen not so much because of a short-term step change in military procurement. It will come about because Putin has forced us all into a new configuration of Eurasian security, and Europe must respond to that new reality. The US, don't forget, is primarily preoccupied in the Asia-Pacific. Europe is our front line.
Thank you, Professor. And Vice President, I'd like to expand a bit more on this. So my following question to you is, how significant is Germany's announcement of the increase for defense spending for the future of European defense and cooperation? And did Putin achieve everything he didn't want to? So will he be remembered as the one who revived NATO and, so to say, made the European Union great again?
Mr. Putin will be, first of all, remembered as a war criminal who invaded a peaceful neighboring country and is responsible for the death of many, many innocent civilians, children, women, and men. The aggressive behavior of the Kremlin, and here I agree with Professor Howorth, has certainly strengthened the partnership between us here in Europe and our transatlantic allies. As I mentioned, we have seen, after some initial difficulties, we have seen remarkable unity between the EU, NATO, the G7, and other like-minded democratic partners in facing this Russian aggression. My party, the German CDU, has always been calling for more defense spending in Germany. This was blocked in the last term under the so-called Grand Coalition, the last term of Chancellor Merkel, by a finance minister of the Social Democratic Party called Olaf Scholz. We were always in favor of Germany having to fulfill the 2% commitment which all NATO partners agreed upon in 2014 in Wales. Now, the 24th of February, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed everything. I welcome that Germany will actually spend more on defense. Until now, its announcement. We want to see concrete implementation. And the second thing is, this is not short term, this is mid and long term. Germany is economically the strongest country in the European Union, and Germany has to shoulder more responsibility in solidarity with our European partners and our NATO allies. So we will spend more, but the second point is also we need to spend it more effectively than we have done until now.
Thank you, Vice President. And Professor Howorth, in your previous work before the war in Ukraine, you stated that nobody really believed that Ukraine would join NATO one day. Do you still think that this is the case? Will the West see Ukraine with different eyes? Will there be unity in accepting eventually Ukraine within NATO and within EU as member? Or do you see that this war implies bringing down of a new type of an Iron Curtain across Europe?
Well, in the 30-year saga of NATO expansion, Ukraine occupied a unique place. Successive US governments believed that the end point of enlargement would be the inclusion of Ukraine. Ukraine was the first and by far the most important of the former Soviet republics to declare its independence. Yet Washington also knew this would be a Russian red line, extremely difficult to cross. Nobody wanted to draw a new dividing line across Europe, especially not one that would exclude Ukraine. But it was also impossible to draw a line that would include Ukraine. In short, Washington faced an impossible dilemma. It was unthinkable not to offer membership to Ukraine, and it was impossible to offer it. And so we got the 2008 NATO Bucharest fudge. Now, major European states, including Germany and France, totally opposed to Ukrainian membership. And Article 10 of the NATO treaty makes it clear there has to be unanimity, and any joining state has to contribute to security. And that's why most people believed, and I think still do, and I've consulted American colleagues on this, that the prospects of Ukrainian membership remain very, very, very low. The one circumstance under which that could change would be if Russia were actually defeated in this war. But that actually seems hard to imagine. I think the question of a new line being drawn across Europe, I mean, barring the unlikely prospect of a defeat for Russia, some sort of new line is already being drawn. It's not clear how the West would react to this new line across the continent. The implication would be another eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation between two nuclear-armed Goliaths, and that is disaster for everybody. Putin initially tried to engage the West in negotiations over some new overall Eurasian security order, as they saw it, and some of his demands were obviously non-negotiable, which led many to argue that he intended all along to invade. Nevertheless, West does have reason to enter into negotiations with Russia on arms control, confidence-building measures, conventional defenses, conventional forces, counterterrorism, lots of things. So it's not beyond the bounds of the possible at some point when this war either runs into an impasse or runs its course, that each side will begin to engage with a serious agenda that addresses the security concerns of all parties. Now, I'm not going to gaze into a crystal ball. Many analysts on both sides of the Atlantic believe that will ultimately lead to some form of neutrality for Ukraine and possibly for Georgia too. And that's a depressing prospect for a country that has fought so courageously. But as with EU membership, NATO membership on this issue remains extremely difficult to imagine for most analysts.
Thank you, Professor Howorth. And Vice President, let us turn to another active actor in this war, and I'm talking about Belarus. Lukashenko's regime has been a facilitator in this war, with being an aid to Putin. What should the EU's approach be towards Lukashenko, and what role do you see for Belarus in Europe?
As I previously mentioned, the military aggression against Ukraine was partly launched from the territory of Belarus. And if you look at the events on the outskirts of Kiev, just look at the map, you can understand that without the support of Belarus, this assault on Kiev wouldn't have been possible like it is now being conducted. So we have to be crystal clear here. The regime of Mr. Lukashenko has assisted and enabled the Russian aggression and also actively supported the war. So we need to also strongly condemn the role of Belarus in this war. And now the illegitimate president of Belarus has just held a fabricated referendum in order to amend the constitution and impair Belarus' neutrality. Now, just imagine the presence of Russian nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus would be an additional huge threat to the security of Europe. So this means that the European Union should adopt sanctions against Belarus the way they were also adopted against Russia. So this includes to ban the purchase of goods and services originating from Belarus. This means to block Belarusian banks from the European financial system, SWIFT. This means to adopt targeted sanctions against individuals responsible for high-level corruption in Minsk, as well as oligarchs and officials close to the leadership. And it also means to terminate the software licenses for military and civilian equipment, just to name a few examples. So I think it's important that we, in our political communication, also mention dictator Lukashenko and his regime as also a perpetrator. And in the end, Mr. Putin and Mr. Lukashenko and his regime and their regimes will be held accountable for what they have committed.
Thank you. And Professor Howorth, I'd like also to hear your opinion as to Belarus' role in this war and Belarus' role in Europe in the future.
Well, of all the former Soviet republics which the EU's Eastern Partnership has engaged with, Belarus has been the most impervious to any European overtures. And as has been said, Belarus is effectively merging more and more tightly with Russia. And last week's constitutional referendum is terribly concerning. Lukashenko has become a Putin puppet. And I agree entirely on massive sanctions against Belarus. But this is terrible news for the Belarusian people, who may still try to take their fate into their own hands. The Belarus opposition leader in exile, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, with extraordinary courage, is attempting to set up a government in exile and has accused Lukashenko of treason. Right now, it's very, very difficult to see how this is going to be resolved positively, other than through a defeat for Russia. The sanctions may work to a certain extent. A popular uprising in wartime is highly unlikely. And if a new dividing line is set down across Europe, with Belarus to the east of that line, there really seems little prospect of Belarus having any role in Europe other than as a Russian puppet.
Thank you, Professor. And to conclude this interview, I have one last question, which has already been touched upon briefly by Vice President at the beginning. And the question is, can Europe survive without Russian gas? Vice President McAllister.
We have discussed this in recent days as European People's Party and also in the European Parliament, and it is obvious that we need to urgently reduce our energy independence, in particular on Russian gas, Russian oil, and Russian coal, by doing many things, including diversifying energy sources, including expanding liquefied natural gas terminals and supply routes, unbundling gas storage and increasing energy efficiency, and also the speed of the clean energy transition. This will be extremely hard work, but the Commission has already done good preparatory work, diversifying our energy supplies gas, for instance, LNG gas from the United States, Algeria, Qatar, Azerbaijan. There are other suppliers. And we have to learn a lesson that some of our member states are far too dependent on Russian energy imports. And that's why we also as EPP welcome that finally the Nord Stream 2 pipeline will be definitively, or should be definitively abandoned. We welcome the decision of the German government to halt the certification of Nord Stream 2. But one thing is very clear, the geopolitical consequences of this project were certainly underestimated at the beginning, and that's why I call for us to, in general, closer coordinate energy policies in the European Union in the future.
Thank you, Vice President. And Professor Howorth, your remarks on the Russian gas in Europe, please.
Well, can Europe survive without Russian gas? Yes, but it's going to be tough. For the moment, the gas continues to flow. In fact, the volume coming into Europe via the main pipeline has more than doubled since the beginning of the war. And Putin's threat to cut off the gas, rather like his nuclear threat, seems like shooting himself in the foot. 40% of EU gas currently comes from Russia, with big variations between different EU states. And that's why so far sanctions have not been applied against the hydrocarbon sector. There are several avenues, as has been said, which could be explored to escape the stranglehold that Russia enjoys over gas supplies to Europe. The first, obviously, is to invest in renewables, and the EU is pushing that vigorously. The second is to seek alternatives. We've heard all that, particularly from the US, the Caucasus, and also from Norway, which currently is a major supplier for France. A third avenue, especially given the degree of unity that currently seems to exist in Europe, is to create a central European purchasing agency that would also be responsible for a more equitable distribution of gas across the EU 27. And a fourth approach, and this will be easier as spring turns into summer, is to consume less. But in the long term, as David McAllister said, one of the major takeaways from this crisis is that the EU will now vigorously pursue a policy of minimal dependency on Russia. Again, Putin shooting himself in the foot.
Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to thank the Vice President McAllister and Professor Howorth for your insights and your analysis. And thank you to all the online viewers who followed this interview. We will continue monitoring the tragic events taking place in Ukraine. And of course, we will continue supporting Ukraine in its fight against the invasion. Thanks again, everyone, for watching, and continue following the EPP and the Martin Center for the next episode of Come Together. Thank you again, and see you soon.